Welcome to Jedi with Daniel. I am your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. I have spoken many times on the podcast about how certain academic fields, specifically in the humanities and social sciences, have somehow in the last 10 to 15, other people might want to argue 30 to 50 years, have taken this knee-jerk turn, not just into wider left-wing views of the world, but also coinciding with a staunch anti-Zionism that post-October 7th really has been proliferating in the academy, and anybody who's paying attention cannot avoid it. Today, we are welcoming Adam Louis-Klein onto the podcast. Adam is both a writer and anthropologist and is in the middle of his PhD studies in anthropology at McGill University. Adam, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking
So
forward
I
to it.
know a lot of grad students, mostly at UC Irvine, that are in similar related fields, humanities and social sciences, and the vast majority of them are too afraid to speak out against anti-Semitism, even behind closed doors with friends of theirs in
Mhm.
their grad program. You are publishing, blog posts on Times of Israel, academic articles about anti-Semitism, things on Facebook about it. I'm just curious, before we even talk about any of the content, what has been your personal effect as a grad student? I can't imagine in the anthropology department, a lot of people are, giving you standing ovations when you're walking in.
No, so yeah, within the anthropology department at McGill, um, I guess I'll just say it. No one will really touch what I'm doing, but that's okay. That's not the worst position to be in. So I did have a lot of run-ins with people, students, faculty, but it mostly goes nowhere because the kind of consensus that's been constructed around these issues in the academy is basically just we're right, you're wrong. Israel's doing a genocide. You can't question this. And you also cannot bring up anti-Semitism. So yes, you will also be punished career-wise, etc. But I'll just say that I'm in a position where I will be able to finish my PhD, and I'm happy that I'm able to be public with writing about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I'm lucky at some level, but I certainly have not um, uh, evaded plenty of harassment and hostility.
Yeah, and I'm sure, and we definitely don't have to go this route. It's just something that I know whenever I speak to current graduate students about their reticence. And even at times, grad students, I think, are the one category of people where often, and undergrads are the same, where I usually coach them and say, listen, it might not actually be worth it for you to make a big stink about this. Wait until you're in industry or you're on a, you have tenure and then, be as loud as you can. And so I'm sure maybe it'll catch up to you in the hiring process because obviously, so much of what's come out in the last couple of years is, this sort of circular hiring in a lot of academic tracks. I won't put you on the spot there. I have a more general question about the social sciences and humanities. Has it sort of hurt your faith in the epistemology of the field at all? In other words, there is a sort of idealistic view of many fields in the academy that this is just a pursuit of truth and, all the scientific methods, yada, yada, yada. I've talked about this on the podcast before. Given what's coming out of a lot of the fields, if I were to read your average journal entry from an anthropology, scholar, I am starting off with, as much epistemological certainty as if I'm reading a random post from somebody on Twitter, meaning the addition, and sorry if this seems somewhat offensive, but the addition of a PhD in anthropology for me, that does actually nothing to move my benchmark of epistemology versus if you were here and you had a PhD in physics, I would definitely trust you if we were talking about how to construct a bridge. Yes, the bridge is all atoms. If we're talking about something else, like I'm like, okay, so you've read a little bit more of the lingo of scholarship of anthropology, but how do you now see the field as a whole? And you don't have to pick just anthropology. I think sociology is the same, Middle East studies, gender studies, all those related fields.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way that you put it, actually. Like what do you think of the epistemology of the field? Because what I find is that, anthropology, humanities, social sciences, the basis today, universally, of all of these disciplines is the notion of critique. So we critique structures of oppression, power, and domination, and that is the starting assumption of essentially every field and every work. If you go and study with an indigenous people, you better show that you have your critique of colonialism. You better show that you've reflexively analyzed your positionality as a white European in that space, right? So what's then stunning to see is that the critique of anti-Semitism is the one critique that's not allowed. And we're not allowed to do what some people have called metacritique. So, this whole critical complex of academia itself, when we see it becoming an anti Semitic or anti Zionist ritual of condemnation, and understanding that as a structure of discrimination, of double standards, or whatever to Jews, that's something that one can't critique. One isn't allowed to take that step. So critique has become its opposite. It's become unquestioned consensus. So we saw this, for example, in the 2024 AAA's, the American Anthropological Association grand meeting. So their meeting was on the Gaza genocide, but it wasn't as something to debate. It was the premise, as if we all show up and we believe in the Gaza genocide. Let's talk about it as like a thing in the world, which is really stunning. And then the Society of Cultural Anthropology had a very similar edition that they put out. And then they recently, just the other day, put out another edition where they were saying, let's we want to oppose these attacks on the settler colonialist framework that's been happening, and show that it does apply to Palestine. And what they said is, we're against exceptionalizing Israel. So it's a very odd approach, as if Jews are sort of calling for an exception rather than calling to be treated fairly. And so I searched through this edition, and stunningly, I couldn't find anywhere in it where Jews were talked about as indigenous. And not even just like as a fact, because it is. I mean, we can discuss that, but even as a claim or as a notion that Jews might themselves think of themselves as indigenous and might find settler colonial theory kind of offensive. Because I think most Jews do find settler colonial theory to apply to Israel just sort of naturally offensive because it jars with our understanding. I'm not saying someone finds something offensive, you can't talk about it in academia, but there seems to be no acknowledgement that it is very inconsistent with our self-conception.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I always say the question, a good faith conversation, and one that I've oftentimes had with students about the overlappingness of colonialism and Zionism is a really interesting conversation. The way that I always teach it is that Zionism is paradoxically a mishmash of a secular, modern, nationalistic, borrowing from the tools of colonialist movement, and at the same time, an ancient religious, diasporic, indigenous movement. And these two things have always been fighting in tension inside Zionism. I think that's a really interesting conversation to have. Needless to say, that's probably not what's happening at the conferences you're talking about. The entire move and switch to frameworks, or the focus on frameworks, sort of belies any objectivity. I mean, it's sort of, if I go into a conversation with you and I say, here is the framework, and I'm curious to sort of get your thoughts on this and push back if you disagree. But if I say, here is the framework I'm coming to this conversation with, say I'm coming at it with a Orthodox Jewish framework, and that's just my framework,
Yes.
it's going to, by definition, tailor your view of a lot of my conclusions. And if you don't accept, say, the tenets of Orthodox Judaism, you're just going to be less inclined to accept my conclusions. But when the
Right.
academy does it somehow, if somebody says they're operating within X, Y, or Z framework,
Mhm.
then their conclusions aren't necessarily true. They're true within this world of the framework, the same way if you were an evangelical Christian and your framework is the New Testament is the word of God and Jesus will return, you could say things that are true within your framework, but if I don't believe in your framework. And so I think that's been the focus, because there's sort of two ways to approach this with a field in the social sciences / humanities. One is that, okay, these fields have some blind spots, and Jews are one of those blind spots. And we need to
Yeah.
work within these fields to sort of fix those blind spots. The
Mhm.
other is that actually this isn't a bug. This is actually a feature. Just these entire frameworks are built on just a faulty view of the world, where anybody who happens to have more power is ipso facto bad. And that's just a framework that I just personally disagree with. So therefore, if I read the conclusions of a sociologist, it's going to be the same thing as me reading something from, I don't know, an evangelical Christian. It's really interesting to see what they think will happen, in end times when Jesus returns. Maybe I'm interested as somebody who's fascinated by religion, but
Mhm.
that's gonna, the messianic prophecies of Jesus in the end times will bear no consequence of how I think of the world and how I live my life. And I kind of start to see the conclusions out of a lot of these fields as the same way. It's really interesting to read about the
Mhm.
epistemology and the, theology of these academic groups according to X, Y, or Z framework. But I don't know. Are you seeing this as like we just need to fix these, couple rough around the edges, or is this just a fundamental problem that these fields have moved into?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of putting it. I like the analogy you made to Orthodox Judaism. Like, yes, these have become closed systems. They've become dogmatic systems that can't be questioned because they're so committed to their initial premises, and they're building a whole architecture. So the whole architecture of settler colonialism applied to Israel depends on the premise that Jews aren't indigenous. I mean, perhaps you could argue, I've heard some people say settler colonial methods for a native people, but I will say that it's extremely rare to hear that. You know, most of it is just Jews are settler colonials, Jews are European, and that's certainly also how it's come into the popular discourse. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to have a discussion about the way Zionism incorporated certain European notions, and even from the British Empire or whatever. I also think that we should talk about how Arab nationalism, all nationalisms, they say that Zionism is a nationalism, and that has nothing to do with Judaism, right? Because Judaism never had this modern nationalist concept. You hear this a lot in the anti-Zionist space. Um, but you could make the same claim about any nationalism, about Arab nationalism, et cetera. So the standards aren't necessarily really applied there. As to the question of like, is it an inherent problem? I see this coming from the right or center right, and it's interesting about, wokeness as such, or, leftism as such. Maybe leftism doesn't have any space for meritocracy. It always assumes power is bad, for example, like you were talking about, I think in your last podcast. And it always assumes people who have more success are gaining the system in an unjust way. And I think that's a compelling argument. Like if you believe that, it does seem easy to become an anti-Semite, because then you ask, why are Jews successful? And, traditionally that's, money, power, but also having a state and having more power than at least Palestinians. Um, but at the same time, I think that we shouldn't, those are interesting points, and they should be part of the space of debate and the space of reason and viewpoint diversity within the academy, which currently doesn't exist. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that fundamentally critical theory or critical race theory or deconstructing languages of oppression is also inherently bad. That's not the problem. The problem is they're being weaponized and turned into kind of a structure of libel. So what starts out as supposed critiques, colonization, white supremacy, or whatever you want to call it, and attempts to tag Israel with these things, they've been turned into libels, basically just one sentence accusations that you can quickly propagate and that cause anger and hatred. And that's not just on social media. It's the language and behavior of academics themselves today is extremely similar to just the general activist social media discourse, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, which needless to say is a problem. I mean, there are sort of two minds of this, and in a couple minutes I'll ask you this, but I want to stay on this topic for a minute. But just to whet your appetite, one is that the entire academic system is something that can be reformed from within. The other is that you sort of need this external reforming, attacks from the federal government, and something that I'm personally torn on. So, but we'll cross that in a minute. The idea of disconnecting, that you said about nationalism, I always just find it both just a historical error and also just sort of offensive for people to say, well, Judaism never really had this nationalistic component. I'm teaching right now a summer series on modern Jewish philosophy. And so, you look at all the Jewish thinkers in the 17 and 1800s, from Moses Mendelssohn to Avraham Geiger, the father of the Reform movement, to Simson Raphael Hirsch, the father of modern Orthodoxy, almost everybody in between, and they were all very strongly making the argument that Judaism is not a nationalist movement, but they were doing that because the bar of being granted emancipation in places like France and then Germany and then later on other Western European countries was, we are only going to grant Jews emancipation if they throw off their claim to being a nation. And so, you have the famous, I'm forgetting the name, but the famous, it wasn't Napoleon, one of the other leaders of the French Revolution saying, Jews should be granted everything as individuals, but nothing as a nation. And so most Jews, understandably, in the 1800s said, okay, this was obviously, long before, political Zionism really came onto the scene. They said, okay, we'll take that bargain. It's not like, we'll say Judaism is just a religion if that means, civil rights and being treated as, individuals and basic liberty and everything like that. And so the only reason why Judaism made this conceptual switch was because of the inherent anti-Semitism that was happening within the West in the 1800s. And then all of a sudden now, where the Jewish world has obviously shifted in the last 200 years, those same things that Jews were just doing to block anti-Semitism are now being used to defend anti-Semitism. So the whole thing is just perverse. And the biggest irony is that, in the academy, there has been this move. And, when I was in grad school, it was the same thing, to try to reduce as much Eurocentrism as possible, right? And this sort of, parallels with critiques of colonialism and everything like that. But the view that the academy has towards Jews are like the most Eurocentric, both we can talk about the legacy of medieval Christianity, the legacy of 18 and 1900s anti-Semitism, the legacy of, Protocols of Elders of Zion. I know that's obviously, dipping into Eastern Europe now, but like, does the academy not realize, because I've long been out of sort of, the grad school academy. I mean, I'm still very interested in Jewish studies, something I'll ask you about also soon, because you wrote an interesting post about that a few weeks ago. But do these academics or grad students, when you are able to have these honest conversations, do they not understand that the view that they are pushing forward about Jews, such as that Judaism is a religion, which, we both know religion is sort of a 17 and 1800s Protestant Western European term. So it's just a Eurocentric definition of Judaism that they're hoisting on us. Do they not realize the irony of what they're doing? An entire field that framework is reduce Eurocentrism, but then the way that they approach Jews as like the most Eurocentric thing possible?
No. So that you are touching on what is so crazy about this irony and double standards. So for example, I've learned, all those same critical moves, especially about indigenous people, for example, in the Amazon. It's very common now to say when anthropologists go to an indigenous people in the Amazon, traditionally we've used our own Western domains. There's religion, there's economy, there's kinship, there's politics, and these are all separate in our kind of Western understanding. And it's become very commonplace to say, well, if you look at these societies, these concepts and these categories don't really apply. And so you have to have, like, they call it an emic approach, like a sui generis understanding of the categories of the society you work with. So, but when it comes to Jews, they do not apply this whatsoever. But I think that's also because they say Jews are just European. So what they're doing is they're sort of through ignorance, I think it's nothing more than that. They see Jews as really just a white people. So they actually don't really see us as an ethnicity or as a distinct people. So they find it sort of odd when someone might make this argument. The
But this
Jews,
is also, sorry to cut you off. Part of the reason why I find this so perverse is that, I mean, I'm not saying anything you don't know, but just to spell out, I'm sure my listeners are probably sick of me saying this also, but when being non-European was a bad thing, Jews were not European, which,
yeah.
Explains the entire 17, 18, and 1900s, not to mention the Middle Ages, where it was much worse. Now, all of a sudden, in certain areas of the academy, when being European is a bad thing, Jews are just European. And so it's just such a perverse switch. And it is Eurocentric because, I mean, I know you probably agree, but just, I mean, even the fact that Israel obviously is a majority Mizrahi Jewish country, which is sort of, I think a basic fact that anybody talking about Israel these days should know about. I mean, the whole thing just sort of, I guess the reason why I started with this question of epistemology is it's almost the same way that people have lost trust in a lot of big institutions. Let's say, another, random tangent that we don't have to necessarily go on, but obviously there's been a lot written on, loss of trust in institutions when they get like very obvious things wrong. And so, we can talk about the systematic attempt to say, you can't even suggest COVID originated from a lab when it's still just an open question. I think any honest person should say, like, I don't know, like, let's follow the evidence. But any news source that was blocking and taking down content of anyone who was suggesting, like, hey, maybe it originated from this lab, like, my trust in that news source for future stories of things I know nothing about is just lower for something that I know well, which is Jewish identity. When I see different disciplines. Like, I don't know anything about anthropology. I never took a class in anthropology. I don't think I've ever read a book about anthropology. And please push back if you disagree with what I'm about to say. But I almost feel like now the field has almost nothing to teach me, because if they get the thing I know the most about just so wrong, why should I trust what they say about, I don't know, indigenous tribes in Peru, another topic I know nothing about, but like, who's to say they're not also 100% wrong about that? So just like, that's what I was sort of talking about with the loss of faith and shattering of
Yeah.
epistemology. And so, but like, please push back if you disagree, because I want my faith to be restored in these fields, because I do appreciate, academia and everything like that, which is, I guess, where we'll get to in a few minutes with the federal attacks. But just because this is the one issue I know most about, when I see somebody just getting this completely wrong, I don't know, it's just hard to take them seriously in something else.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and it dovetails with what you were saying before. Like, is this an inherent problem with these frameworks, or is it just how they're being applied? Sometimes I think it's a little bit hard to disentangle. I do think that the double standards are really important. So they will apply metrics and frames of analysis that are compelling in other cases, but refuse to apply them to Jews. So, for example, we've heard a lot about binaries in general and how binaries are bad, and we like complexity, and we've certainly understood that identity is like the most complex thing in the world. We all have multiple identities. We're all crossed by different relations of kinship and power, or whatever. But then, as you're saying with respect to Jews, like Jews are just these Europeans. That's stunningly binary, basically. So Jews are Europeans, Palestinians are non-Europeans. Jews are colonizers, Palestinians are colonized. It's stunningly binary, and it doesn't make any space for the complexity of Jewish identity. I thought people knew about this, because like if you read a lot of Jewish thought or Jewish philosophy, or, Adorno or Levinas and Martin Buber, I mean, Rosenzweig, like, people read that stuff, I think. And it talks about Jewish identity and, the sort of um, just immense complexity and duality and hybridity of Jewish identity itself. But that's completely left out of the question, except by Jewish studies. But then, of course, Jewish studies takes it in quite a strange direction. I think they sort of reify this hybridity of modern Jewish identity as diaspora, and then they conflate basically anti-Zionism with the hyphen with anti-Zionism without the hyphen, which is like David Hirsch's kind of distinction, where these are two different ideologies.
Mm.
They have completely different genealogies, tropes, symbols, etc. And that's how we distinguish ideologies, in the social sciences. So like anti-Zionism with a hyphen is the Bund, it's binationalism, and that's all great. So when they say, how can you say the Bund and binationalism is anti-Semitic, right? Like they're sort of right, but what they're not right about is that anti-Zionism, as we're seeing it today, or as is institutionalized at the UN, or that was pushed by Arab nationalism and Islamism today, has anything to do with that, right? Because anti-Zionism without the hyphen, its genealogy is in Nazism and Islamism and Soviet anti-Semitism, which sort of updated the protocols of the Elders of Zion and put it in anti-colonial language. Like this is the work of Isabella Tabarovsky, which is so incredibly important here. Not enough people know about this genealogy, and I think Jewish studies has ignored it completely. And then we have contemporary anti-Semitism studies, which is um, drawing attention to it. But these two fields don't seem to me to really be interacting as far as I'm aware.
Mm. No, that's a really profound. I just want to highlight that point. Well, one, I'll just
Yeah.
flag. I've talked to Isabel on the podcast twice before. I think one of her episodes is still my most listened to one. She's an incredible scholar doing important work on, Soviet anti-Zionism slash anti-Semitism. What you said, I think, is so important. Just this morning, actually, there's a couple of anti-Zionist students that I'm in pretty regular touch with, and one of them literally sent me this morning, and I think they actually listened to the podcast, so I'll give a shout out. I won't give their name, but they, that Jacobin magazine, posted about some Jewish communist in 1943 that wrote this novel critiquing Zionism and, essentially trying to prove the point. And, I think the caption in Jacobin magazine was, there's always been another type of, while Zionism tries to claim, hegemony over Jewish identity, there's always been another way. And your point, so perfectly encapsulates that, where there was, and I would argue still is, a very good and reasonable debate about Zionism to be had in the Jewish community. I think you have that between groups like Satmar and the rest of the Jewish community. You even have that with, more progressive Jewish types where I think there could be good faith conversation. I think George Steiner is one such person. He's obviously passed away a couple years ago, but just like a very profound criticism of what it means to take this tradition that was mostly religious like, I'll use that term, over the last 1800 years at least, and try to reshove it back into the bureaucratic trappings of a nation state. Like, that is such an interesting conversation that we should all be having. That is not at all the same thing as somebody saying Zionists are Nazi, genocidal, white supremacists. Like, I know we call them both anti-Zionism, which is why I appreciate the move to, like, separate and hyphen. I mean, we should probably come up with just two completely different names, or maybe we do have. One is anti-Semitism and one is, reasonable discussion of the place of Zionism in Jewish thought, or whatever, but the fact that so many in the academy want to just conflate the two of, like, oh, see, Franz Rosenzweig was, Hermann Cohen were anti-Zionists, and, George Steiner was critical of Zionism. Therefore, we can say that, I don't know, Bibi is Hitler and just wants to kill a bunch of babies. Like, so see, we're not anti-Semitic. Like, it's
Yeah.
just such a category error. So I'm glad you said that. I do want to move a little bit to Jewish studies because, Jewish studies is obviously the academic field that is closest to heart. I was at some point in my life where I was debating staying in grad school and getting a PhD in Jewish studies or going to rabbinic school. I obviously chose the rabbi path, but I still have stayed very connected. I teach Jewish studies. I'm very interested in moves in the academy. And what you highlighted before, I know you've also written posts about this. Um, you sort of make the separation in at least a couple of your articles, and let me know if I've gotten this correctly. I think it's a very important differentiation where you say the scholarship of a lot of top Jewish studies scholars, even that themselves might, hold anti-Zionist or anti-Israel views, like, it's good scholarship. And I've actually, I've talked to Shaul Magi twice on this podcast, and they've actually been some of my favorite episodes because such an incredible scholar of Hasidism and Kabbalah and the Orthodox world and even anti-Zionist trends. And, I love it. And, I try to read, whatever I can get my hands on. And so that's one thing, like, existing within this, academic, like, let's talk about this. Yes, there are reasonable criticisms of Zionism to be had in sort of the academic realm. The other, which is what you focus on, is the failure of Jewish studies to come to the defense of Jews. That's sort of inexcusable. So can you talk a little bit about this differentiation? First, let me make sure that I actually understood you correctly. But then I would love to hear you, highlight and delineate this differentiation you made.
Yeah, I think it's two things. I think it's the conceptual conflation between anti-Zionism with the hyphen versus anti-Zionism without that drives certain Jewish studies professors to align themselves with the anti-Zionist movement and to make excuses for the anti-Semitic dimensions of anti-Zionism, or to make excuses, let's just say, for anti-Zionism as a hate movement today. And then the other is pressures of assimilation. So I think there's a strong pressure of assimilation in the academy because of the majority power of non-Jewish academics. So when they cite things, when they treat works as respectable, these works become standard. You have to respect them yourselves, even if they embed anti-Semitic, blatantly anti-Semitic assumptions into them. So there's a pressure to conform, and it comes with material benefits and career, et cetera. So we've always seen this in terms of the anti-Zionist Jew, the self-hating Jew, a bit more of a polemical term, but I think, internalizing the patterns of majority power. So I think it's both things. I think it's a conceptual conflation and assimilation and internalization of anti-Jewish oppression. But I think that I would hope that by making this conflation clearer, maybe those professors, if they're listening, can sort of um, uh, recorrect, because I don't think they're necessarily trying to harm Jews, but maybe they haven't themselves fully understood that distinction.
There is also a little bit, and I'm actually a little bit torn of what I'm about to say because, you know, well, one, I'll flag, the history of Jewish studies is very different than the history of other ethnic studies. To the best of my knowledge, other ethnic studies mostly arose mid to late 20th century. And I think there was an explicit activist tinge to a lot of, I'm not making any normative statements here about whether it's good or bad, but like African American studies, women's studies, these were 1960s, 70s, 80s movements where it was always kind of impossible to separate the activism from the scholarship in a way where
Right.
Jewish studies very much were talking about late 1700s, early 1800s, the Wissenschaft school, then coming to America. It was always attempting to be more of a pure academic field, the same way that, history attempts to be, this pure academic field. Obviously
Mhm.
today, those lines are blurred a bunch. And so part of me, bemoans the fact that again, all the caveats that I gave before about a lot of other scholarly fields, it's the same thing. When I read something from a woman studies department, say about the gender pay gap, I don't know much about the background of the gender pay gap, but I'm just as likely to trust what Ben Shapiro says as to what the head of the gender studies department says at UC Irvine, meaning like these are both voices. The arguments they're making can sound credible, and like neither one has any more epistemological strength in my mind because I think these fields have been tainted. With Jewish studies, there always was, from the 1800s onwards, this like, no, we are specifically not activists for the Jewish cause. We're actually trying to pursue, correct research. And so in some way, I don't want Jewish studies to get muddied within the activism. On the other hand, this is just another case of the double standard of, well, wait a minute. Every department is allowed to be activists for the cause of the group that they're studying, aside for Jews. When Jews do it, it's bad. So then Jewish study scholars not only are not defending Jews, but oftentimes, and this is not really the case where I work, although there's a little bit of nuance to that statement for people that have followed UC Irvine happenings. But on a lot of campuses, I talk to Hillel professionals and student leaders, and they say that the biggest thorn in their side oftentimes is Jewish studies professors, because these are people with a lot of clout. And if a Jewish studies professor says, actually, the encampment was not anti-Semitic, that wipes away months of student activism and Hillel activism trying to say like, hey, globalizing Antifada seems a little bit problematic. All it takes is one letter signed by, three Jewish studies scholars at the university for the university to say, oh, okay, the experts have weighed in, and if the experts say, X, Y, or Z, who cares what, the students are saying. So there is a little bit of an unfair double standard there, but I am personally actually very torn in this issue when it comes to like, I don't know if I want Jewish studies scholars to be like, speaking out against certain things. On the other hand, I don't want the entire field of ethnic studies to be doing that. So I've more been turning in the direction, and this will, I think, get to questions about federal pressure in the university in a minute. I've become a lot less of an idealist in the last 2 years. And I think this has been evident to people following my conversation. I was defending, in a year ago, or at least playing devil's advocate, not a year ago, a couple months ago, when the guy from Colombia, Mohammed, forgetting his last name, was, kicked out of the country. And I was, defending the idea that I don't know if I agree with, but I'm at least willing to entertain it, that to defend liberalism, you actually need to be illiberal at times. And so that is by definition a loss of idealism that I think I've had. And so the idealistic me of a couple years ago is now overshadowed by sort of the realpolitik me of like, yeah, if these Jewish studies scholars are not going to come and help Jews when we need it the most, like kind of screw them attitude. I don't like that I'm having that conceptual shift, but you can play, I guess, armchair Zoom therapist here without a comment.
Yeah, so I think that that assimilation that happened with Jewish studies, it was an assimilation to activism, I think. So in order to prove their legitimacy, I think that they took up activism. It was just activism against the Jews, because that's the only recognizable form of activism. So anti-Zionism has appropriated the entire levers of academic legitimacy and activist legitimacy. So the very language of academia, of opposing oppression, whether you're doing that in a published paper or you have sign with a slogan, is fundamentally captured at this point by anti-Zionism. So there's no way to even appear legitimate right now in the academy as a Zionist. They don't even believe that that's possible. I find that when I speak back to them sometimes using their own language, and I didn't start with my writing intentionally trying to mirror their own language, it's just the very same language I think in because it's the same material that I've read and the same concepts that I'm often committed to. But they often act as if it's really odd, or it's not even acceptable or even possible. It's sort of illegible. Someone speaking back to them in sort of leftese, in critique of oppression language. So that's why I think it's really important to build parallel spaces and to sort of build a kind of new Jewish discourse, a new Jewish intellectual discourse where we take this stuff back. So that's why I think I wouldn't just jump on the right and the right's position, which is like Zionism is just like defiant. It's like a strongman ideology. Um, but like I was saying before, I would incorporate the conservatives into the conversation and take into account, there's a reason that they have been supportive of the Jewish community and the left hasn't. And we have to acknowledge that and think with conservatives and their points of view. But at the same time, we need to reclaim this lefty language in order to create new spaces of legitimacy to show them, because they're not going to listen to us. They're not open to argument. But if they see that we are actually doing this work, we might be able to regain legitimacy in those spaces.
So they're not, I mean, just sort of hopping after something you've said. My biggest internal, political turmoil of the last couple months has been whether or not I'm happy with what Trump is doing to universities. I talk to so many people that have such strong opinions on both sides, and I am genuinely torn. I feel like I can have a fascinating podcast if I just debate myself on this issue. And I think, I'm sure half the people listening would think I've gone crazy, but the other half might find it interesting. One view for the yes, just tear it all down approach, which is honestly funny because in some way it mirrors a lot of leftist discourse for other institutions,
Yeah.
is just to say, listen, these are, institutions are not going to self-reform. I'm not, I don't think Columbia is going to, they've had all the chances in the world to self-reform. And so, yes, let's just tear it down. Let's cut all the funding, even worse on the public schools. My state tax money in California is going to funding schools that are then funding graduate students and professors who are actively doing things to make my life more dangerous. And so, from that perspective, it's like, well, it'd be crazy to not want to tear down the institutions. Obviously, there's many good arguments on the other side. I don't think this is an open and shut case. But what you're proposing, I think, is sort of maybe would be the most idealistic way, but it's also the hardest way. In other words, like create this parallel track within these fields that are super, non-welcoming to Jews and show them like, hey, listen, there's interesting Jewish discourse about this in a non-binary situation of Jewish. But like, I feel like we've kind of tried that in some way. The problem is, and you could either speak about personal experience or, just a national or international experience, they're not even willing to have those conversations. Like I know grad students, one grad student I know well, she's in the social sciences. She won't even, no one talks to her and she's never posted anything about Israel. She just happens to attend Hillel events and, other grad students, it's sort of the exact same thing. So even if those people were all as well read as, the top Jewish scholar in the world, like that's not going to make a difference if you're walking into a room and so to some extent, it's like, you know, yeah, I don't know. I mean, the irony that I just want to, hang on one more time is it is the exact same as the left wing. Yes, we just need to tear down the police because there's a little bit of systematic problems in there. But on the other hand, I think that it can be a compelling argument. So I would love to sort of get your thoughts. You could either comment on, the federal attacks or just, more generally.
Yeah, so I think both things need to happen. I think the devil is in the details, a little bit, but I think that the schools need to be punished, of course, for allowing this to happen and for violating Title VI. I think professors who engage in anti-Semitic discrimination and hate speech do need to be punished, and we need to use. So I think the IRA is important. I think it's kind of a transitional tool at this point. And it also has problems in the sense of how it's very much based in the notion of classical anti-Semitism, but then identifies sort of how this new anti-Zionism is continuous with classical anti-Semitism. So, but at the same time, then it's kind of in a transitionary space. So perhaps we might develop IRA or something like it that's more directly focused on anti-Zionism and actually allow anti-Zionism to be recognized itself as hate and as an operator of discrimination and harassment as well. So I think that's a project. I don't think many people are doing that yet at those higher levels of policy and government, but that is what I would propose. And then you use better tools because anti-Zionism has really constructed itself so as to evade the designation of classical anti-Semitism in so many ways. whether it's its rhetorical maneuvers, Judaism isn't Zionism, or this is just criticism of Israel, and that whole debate about criticism of Israel, which is supposed to delay and displace any action of an anti-Zionist violence, as well as the new symbols and associations. We don't have skinheads and neo-Nazis and swastikas. We have Hamas headbands and red triangles, which are new hate symbols that aren't yet fully recognized as hate symbols within a coherent ideology. So I think that the schools need to be punished for violating Title VI. We need to um, um, create more knowledge about anti-Zionism and eventually some kind of formalization at a legal or at least administrative level to basically punish professors who harass in the name of anti-Zionism. And then there's the element of developing these parallel institutions. I mean, so the government can't tell people who to hire or what to put on a curriculum.
No, but
That
the
is
government can essentially say, um, gender studies just oftentimes is the field that I pick on. I've talked about, a couple other podcasts, but just I'll give you the little background. I grew up in a, relatively traditional Orthodox upbringing. And in college, I, ideologically moved out of the Orthodox community, which is why I used the example of orthodoxy before. The reason why I moved out of the Orthodox community, it's a much longer story. I just felt that there were a lot of intellectual conversations about Judaism and history that the Orthodox community had a tighter Overton window than I wanted. That's the sort of SparkNotes version. But then, silly me as a junior in college, thought, well, the academic world, that's like the pure pursuit of truth. And so the quarter at UCLA where I was sort of like navigating my leave of the Orthodox world, I took a bunch of courses in fields that, made me uncomfortable, but just to specifically learn. One of those courses was a gender studies class at UCLA where I, did all the readings, and I would show up to office hours and try to have conversations, not debates, but like, the type of pushback conversation we're having now, any Jewish conversation about anything. And I was like, yo, this idea seems interesting. How does this square with, I don't know, evolutionary biology? And the professor essentially just found like different ways to call me sexist every week whenever I would, or, cis, transphobic, or like all these terms that were coming out, I don't know, 11 years ago when this was. And so since then, in my mind, gender studies is like the epitome of this problem. Anyway, that's a long digression to saying the government can't say to the UCLA Gender Studies department, you have to hire two people who think that like the whole trans phenomenon is just like a mass delusion, nor would I want the government to say that. The government can say, actually, it doesn't help our country at all to have gender studies departments. So the same way that, I don't want the government funding synagogues, even if I value synagogues. I mean, I do value synagogues. My salary is paid for by, Jewish nonprofits. If the government says, okay, they're not going to fund that, that's in the private industry, and there's separation. I kind of want the government to move that way for certain fields. Again, it's probably some debate about where exactly to draw that line. I do want the government funding cancer research and training people how to build better bridges and how to deal with natural disasters and fires and floods and all the things we've seen lately. But like, how does it? But I guess the conversation more pointedly, and this is something that I think conservatives have been saying for decades. Why does it help the average American in any way to have people coming out with gender studies PhDs that are being paid for by, our tax money? I know how it helps me to have biologists come out with PhDs that are funded by my tax money, and I'm happy to do that. So that would be more the conversation. Like, I don't want the government to get involved in the bureaucracy of university, but they can just completely cut funding to certain areas of the university. The same way I would, levy the same argument for things like NPR. I used to listen to NPR a lot, and then, I don't know if you've listened to NPR since October 7th, but it's turned into exactly what you would expect a progressive, media channel to turn into. And that's also paid. You look at their funding. Yeah, they get some private donations, but my California state tax money funds NPR in California for them to just find different ways to call me a, genocidal colonialist every night on the news. And so, like, even just thinking, and I'm not ready to go full Trump on this, and I would caution people who have moved full Trump, but it is now within, whereas, after 2020, my Overton window had moved such that any even entertaining of voting for Trump in 2024 was like ipso facto off the table. Like, I had conversations with friends of mine, and I'm sort of half in the Orthodox Jewish community, half in the Persian Jewish community, a lot of people who are more on the right. And I would have conversations like, I don't even understand, how you're thinking about this. in 2024, it was like squarely within the Overton window of like, this is really tough. Like, I don't know. And now it's actually moved even more into the Overton window of like, okay, some of the stuff are bad. I don't love, what ICE is doing. On the other hand, like, I actually do feel safer now than I did a year ago because of moves that I think the federal government has made. I threw a
Yeah.
lot at you there, so you can pick
Oh,
up wherever.
100%. I feel so much better after what the federal government has done. And has it had a chilling effect on the anti-Zionists? In a sense, yeah, but it depends how you interpret chilling effect. I mean, they should be afraid to be engaging in harassment and hate speech, which is what they were doing. I mean, they say they weren't, but they were. And so I also feel a bit safer that I'm, not going to get the same kind of blowback, and people are a bit more afraid of discriminating against Israelis or Jews or Zionist Jews, etc. So I think that's a good thing. And I 100% agree with your position on funding. I think anyone who says the government has to fund this is clearly does not understand academic freedom. Academic freedom does not mean that the government has to fund you or that the government can't withdraw funding if they don't like what you're doing. They sort of can do that because they have that freedom, as you said, as a public institution versus like a private institution. We would like the government to be funding, all of our education, but that involves, following the law. So I think that argument is pretty pretty foolproof, if you ask me. I think that, cutting funding to medical stuff, that no one wants that to happen. But I think as long as we're capable of, correctly designating responsibility, the higher levels of the university are responsible for that.
Yeah.
They are the ones to blame. And leftists today, in general, I've noticed, have a lot of trouble sort of doing moral reasoning where you correctly designate responsibility. So they see, people aren't gonna, the medical research is gonna be underfunded, that'll harm people, therefore, removing the funding was bad without being able to see who really caused it. It's actually quite
Well,
analogous.
I mean, in my mind, that's kind of like saying, the economic loss of abolishing slavery is going to lead to X, Y, and Z. It's like that's not a way to
Yeah,
morally reason to say that like
exactly.
your stop of something immoral creates a domino effect. I don't know. Just the whole thing
Yeah.
seems strange.
Well, it's exactly like Hamas, like Palestinian children are dying. No one's ever denied that. It's just that many Jews believe that Hamas is responsible because they started a war, holding hostages, refused to surrender, refused to give up hostages. It's actually incredibly simple, common sense moral reasoning that we should largely blame Hamas for the situation in Gaza, but they aren't really interested in common sense moral reasoning. Your point about the Overton window, I think, is interesting. I've been thinking more that, as Jews, of course, we find ourselves politically homeless as the new form of Jew hate. Anti-Zionism has largely been cultivated on the left. Like we see now more right-wing figures embracing Jew hate, but I think they also do it often as individuals, like as these figures like Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, Kanye. And we don't see these mobs on the street like we've seen with the left. So there's no question that the left right now is significantly more dangerous to Jews. We have Mamdani, whose background is full on Islamism. His father made excuses for the Darfur genocide. His father has glorified suicide bombing. I think Mamdani, the center of Mamdani's politics is Islamism and the Islamist cult of Palestine in particular. So he's extremely dangerous. And we saw the other day, like that was the chair of the DNC basically saying we're going to have a big tent.
Yeah,
Uh,
I was gonna say my good friend Andrew Getrayer, who I've actually also had on the podcast. He was a longtime Hill director. Just posted today that today is the day he officially quit the Democratic Party because of that interview where they were asked about globalize the Intifada, and the answer was Big Tent, which is just again it's crazy. And so yeah, I also did a podcast about right wing anti-Zionism where I talked about Tucker and Candace Owens, but you're 100% right that the systemic nature is now on the left in worrying ways.
Yeah,
So
and we this is a big problem because it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, this sort of move of Jews to the right. So the left has pushed us out of their institutions, and they've done this also through this new form of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, which constructs Jews as sort of right-wing white racists. So if you talk to them, you'll see that they conflate us with an image they have, which is also a demonizing image of white evangelicals. So they sort of take the whole Christian Zionist phenomenon or the phenomenon of evangelicals being very supportive of the Jewish community, and they kind of weaponize that against us, conflate us with them, and then treat us all as right-wing white racists. I mean, it's completely absurd, but this is strongly, I think, how they imagine the Jew today. And so from that basis, they kick us out of their institutions, and then we naturally make allies with the right, and then it creates kind of a self-fulfilling
But
prophecy.
even getting back to my criticism of, or my newfound view of the epistemology of field, it also, so I never I was never an expert on race relations in America and whether or not do I think that the criminal justice system is systemically racist or not. And but as sort of a liberal, in 2020 I was very much on the Black Lives Matter trend. And, I was willing to sort of accept mostly at face value. Yeah, again, I've always had that little critical part of myself, but, I posted hashtag Black Lives Matter and, did all of the things. And, a lot of the stuff I was reading, and I read Ta-Nehisi Coates, like everyone else. And, so I concluded like, okay, this is a problem. I should speak out about this. Now that those same people, I mean, Ta-Nehisi Coates is interesting, but even just the Black Lives Matter movement, that they've also, again, the topic that I know the most about, which is Jews, they get wrong. It's not just the self-fulfilling prophecy of moving me more to the right. It's also, I just trust liberals and progressives less because my thought is, well, wait a minute. If Black Lives Matter is willing to just put out a black and white statement about Jews that I know is factually incorrect. And Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, his new book, I forgot what the name of it, where he describes Israel and it's like clear, it's like a sixth grade progressive version of Israel. I actually no longer take his other work that seriously. I mean, I don't really know how else to say it. And maybe this is sort of like unfair of me in some way. And it's not to say that I'm now, on the right and a conservative because there's a lot of problems with those thoughts, but like, all of a sudden, you know, yeah, like it not only is a self-fulfilling prophecy because it's moved me more away from socially fitting in with a lot of these progressive causes, but intellectually, I'm also a lot more cynical of all this, which I guess is by definition moving me more to the right. So if I see a post today from, Black Lives Matter about in 2024, there's been X amount of, black men disproportionately, arrested for X, Y, or Z, my skepticism going into reading that claim is now like 10 times higher than it was before October 7th. Because now I'm like, okay, it might be true, but I know this group has also lied or, just doesn't understand other things. So, yeah.
I see what you mean. Yeah, yeah. And after Gaza and 10/7, we've seen the left just be completely willing to lie and just make up facts completely to fit their narrative. And yeah, well, how do you know they aren't doing that in this other case as well? Yeah, I've had the same thing. I've asked, because I supported the Black Lives Matter movement, but like, yeah, maybe it was more like anecdotal or something, and it
No, but
wasn't.
I almost like I'm like ashamed at myself that I like jumped so strongly on the Black Lives Matter bandwagon. Like, and maybe that's crazy to say. I mean, I still think a lot of the narrow things that the cause was championing are good and things that people should continue to champion. But like now that I sort of like refresh my memory of what was happening in 2020 and sort of that like, moral push, and then saw how that movement, I mean, even in 2021, there was some problematic things happening with, the Black Lives Matter movement. And, I think the same thing could be said about the trans issue, where we're also, again, like most liberals, my disposition was like, whatever, you do you. Like, the conservative attacks on trans identity, that's just like, unnecessary and mean and, dangerous and everything like that, then I'm sort of like willing to, yes, trans lives matter and, put up an LGBTQ flag on, Pride, LGBTQ month and on all that. I'm sort of ashamed of that too. Not just because the movement has been so willing to wallow in anti-Semitism, but because I just trust them less. Like and with the trans issue, there's actually good reason to trust them less because a lot of now new research is coming up of puberty blockers and the effects and the difference between the way America and Europe is handling it. Whatever, we don't have to go down that rabbit hole. But again, I like don't know another way to think about it than just the same way if your faith is shattered in a religious
Yeah.
closed system, you can still value some of what that religious system does, and there could be some narrow truth to find it, but like the whole system comes crashing down. And that's just how I feel about a lot of these movements now, ranging from like progressive political, social justice causes to the academy. And so, it's not just that they are pushing me out and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm
Yeah.
also like kind of running from it because I'm like, oh my goodness, like I can't believe I ever took the African American Studies department at UCLA as like a moral benchmark when they were posting in 2020, because now what they're posting about is essentially like I deserve to be murdered. So that's also my push, and then I'll stop belaboring this point after you answer.
I think that's really interesting. And I think that we are seeing kind of a breakdown of all political norms. And the whole political spectrum is confusing at this point. It doesn't really make sense like it used to. I mean, we see polarization, we see more extreme groups, and the left has even more, is becoming, lunacy. I mean, like supporting Mahmoud Khalil as if he's, the most important figure. I think that immigrants should be treated as equals, right? But it is weird for a political party to make a non-American, who's clearly supportive of genocidal terrorism into like a positive symbol and figurehead. I mean, that is kind of out of control. But I think out of these ruins, we can create something new. And I think there's a positive moment in there, the fact that we're politically homeless. Because I think that as Jews, we have a right to have our own autonomous political reasoning. So I think that sometimes we have a feeling, almost a little bit of shame, that we don't have a right to stand up for our own interests, and to pursue Jewish interests. I think that's an internalization of anti-Semitism in some ways, that we feel that if we're pursuing our Jewish interests, we might be stepping on other people's toes or taking from someone else, which is exactly how anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism constructs us. If Jews are flourishing in Israel, if Jews have a state, they must be dispossessing, they must be doing injustice to other people. And so I think that yeah, this poses kind of an opportunity to develop more autonomous forms of political reasoning instead of just tagging along the left and buying everything they say about justice, because as Jews, we like justice.
No, totally. Okay, we've been talking for a while, covered a lot of topics. Is there anything else we didn't hit that is fresh on your mind or you wanted to tease out?
No, I think that sounds good to me. Yeah.
Awesome. How can people find you if they want to stay updated with your writings?
So the best way is to go to my website. It's Adam Louis, Louis Klein, Klein.com. And there's links to my X and my Facebook and my Times of Israel blog.
Amazing. The Times of Israel blog is great. I've been reading it for a while. I apologize for calling you Lewis instead of Louis at the beginning. But Adam, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much.